Hello and welcome to week 10 of history, where we're going to pick up where we left off, at least chronologically, over the past couple of weeks. We'll be spending some time back on the European mainland today. And most of what we talked about in terms of the Renaissance to this point has been, of course, the artistic end of it. And a lot of that started in the city of Florence. Again, Italy, such as it is today, did not exist then. There was an Italian identity among the several scattered city-states, but it was still mostly a bunch of small governments, and we've been focusing on Florence, the de' Medici family, giving birth to Michelangelo, Raphael, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, and basically, Florence was where the Renaissance, as we know it, really began to flourish and kick in, mainly through the field of art. Again, there were other city-states in what's now Italy, and we're going to focus on one this week, the city of Venice. Venice is one of the most fascinating cities in the world. It's really wild how it developed. Venice is essentially a few dozen islands, small islands in the Aegean Sea on the northern coast of what's now Italy. Actually, for many years, it was considered to be part of Austria, even part of Slovenia, I think, at one time. And so its Italian identity, even today, is not very strong. It's truly a multinational city. It is basically a city built around a series of islands with lots of canals in between the islands and with some barrier islands out in front of it. Because of those barrier islands, and barrier islands, if you think about the North Carolina Outer Banks, a little string of islands out beyond the coastline, it really made the water inside very calm. And the water was also very deep, so Venice was ideal for ships to bring in lots of goods on ports with deep water, calm water, and Venice began to accumulate a lot of wealth during the late Middle Ages because of their position as a port city. Of course, if you go to Venice today, it's about 90% tourists there. It's not an economic powerhouse like it used to be, but again, the layout of the city is just spectacular. You can get from anywhere to anywhere in Venice on a boat, a gondola. And they have, of course, lots of infrastructure built around water travel. And it's just an amazing engineering story. And you'll notice in some of the pictures we share here, there are very few buildings in Venice that are single story. When they grew, they couldn't grow out because the islands are only so big. They had to grow up. They added floors to buildings. And it's just amazing that a city becomes so prosperous when basically it's just a bunch of islands out barely off the coast of northern Italy. Now, again, because of its location, you can see where Venice would draw a lot of trade. In terms of generating that east versus west, east and west trade, they were right in the middle. You kind of had to pass through Venice to get there. So Venice kind of became the transfer point. Someone's bringing in goods from Asia, they're going to bring them to Venice, and from Venice they go to the rest of Europe, and vice versa. If you're trying to trade with the East and you're a European merchant, go to Venice because that is where all the goods are shipped out there. Now, of course, Venice started to go downhill when our good buddies, the Portuguese, found the opposite of the overland trade route to Asia, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. So that began Venice's decline as an economic power. But about the time that the Renaissance was really picking up steam, Venice was a very, very significant city-state. They had to and still have to import food to Venice because there's nowhere to grow food. They're islands, and there's really no free land to be had in Venice. But again, it was perfectly situated between the East and the West, so it had the best of both worlds. Marco Polo helped make that happen hundreds of years before the Renaissance began. We're going to talk about one famous artist in particular from Venice today, Titian. His real name was Tiziano Vicelli, and he moved to Venice at a very, very early age when he showed promise as an artist. And it was odd in that he was not your Renaissance man insofar as he was interested in a lot of different things. He was single-minded. Titian was a painter, a very good one. His work, of course, was influenced. It could not help but to be not influenced by Da Vinci and Michelangelo and all those before him. And you can see it in his works. Again, remember how he talked about perspective with Leonardo da Vinci and how he, of course, he had the very detailed background, but also odd perspective sometimes. Titian did a lot of that. He would take the subject of a painting and kind of move them over to the side, but use perspective and light to make them the subject, even though they're sitting here in the lower corner. Lots of his Christian paintings did that, with it moved, Mary, Jesus, whomever, kind of off to the side, but still use light, perspective, and other tricks to make them the focus, even though they weren't literally front and center. He had a very long career. Titian lived to be the age of 90, and so he was active professionally for about 75 years. And as it turned out, he had a chance to work with a lot of the movers and shakers of the time. He was the court painter for Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, later hired by Philip II of Spain. He worked with the Pope Paul III. And again, he, as much as anything else, his longevity and the prolificness of his work make Titian very, very formidable and someone to talk about. He passed away in the year 1576. Oddly enough, as his life faded, that's when Venice's role in the world really started to fade. Again, more and more ships were using the sea route to get from east to west. It was a little less treacherous, and they found that they could do that with a little bit less manpower. So Venice really started to lose its clout then, but again, it's still very much up and running today. And I had a dear friend that visited Venice 2 years ago, and he was just spellbound at the way the city was laid out. He said it's just breathtaking on every single corner. The next lesson in the book focuses on women of the Renaissance, and I don't really know why. Nothing against the ladies, but we've covered a lot of this before. Queen Isabella and whatnot. Be honest, I don't know why the book highlighted some of them. Some interesting reading here, just for background. Margaret Navarre is one in particular. She was born in 1492, same year Columbus set sail for the New World. And she was one of the most educated people, not just women, but people of her age. Again, we're still in a very patriarchal period where it was education for women was seen as frivolous. They weren't going to do anything to merit or to necessitate a big education. But she was Queen of Navarre, a region of Spain, and she was extremely intelligent, could speak practically every language really known in Europe at the time. She supported humanist Catholics and reformers. She was a very calming influence in some of the early days of the Protestant Reformation. So keep her in mind. One other in particular, Teresa of Avila, had an entirely different story. She was born in 1515. She threw herself into reforming the Catholic Church while remaining part of it. Again, you remember Martin Luther, who inadvertently kicked off the Protestant Reformation. He wanted to reform the church from within at first, until he found out that was just simply not possible. Teresa of Avila wanted to do that from her position just as a lowly nun. Her ambition was to take her fellow nuns back to strict servanthood, a very sort of Spartan existence in this monastic lifestyle. She saw that too many nuns had fallen into immorality and worldliness, exactly the opposite of the vows they take. She opened a convent in Spain nicknamed the Shoeless Convent because of her strict guidelines for her nuns living a life of poverty. Her methods were so drastic that even the Inquisition people questioned her sometimes, but her convictions prevailed, and Teresa committed her life to writing of her experiences and promoting spirituality. And she is recognized as sort of the Mother Superior of Mother Superiors. Again, Teresa of Avila in Spain. We're going to shift gears now and go back to religious reform, and we're going to have some sort of vexing questions we're going to have to look at for the next few minutes here. We're going to tell the story of John Calvin, French-born and very, very much alive and pushing in the Protestant Reformation. Again, a little bit of background of where we are at this point. You'll recall a couple of hundred years ago during the late Middle Ages, men of the cloth like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus read the Bible carefully and began questioning some of the church's traditions. Jan Hus was put to death for his beliefs. Many of Wycliffe's followers were put to death. It was just the beginning of church reformation. Again, we've talked about this before. Whereas the Magna Carta in the year 1215 was the result of people starting to ask questions about why are we listening to this king? By what right does this king tell us and everyone else what to do? People started asking questions. Not long after that, people started to ask those same questions of the church. Wycliffe, Hus, and a few others were killed for that. But the questions continued. When the Renaissance started taking hold with the humanist outlook it had, questioning the way things have always been, new ways of doing things, these questions got much more pointed. Again, why are we listening to this Pope? Why are they doing it this way? And as, despite the church's efforts, copies of the Bible became ubiquitous and available in common languages other than Latin, people started reading the Bible for themselves and discovered that a lot of what the Catholic Church was doing had no biblical basis. Again, we are very familiar with our recent look into Martin Luther nailing the 95 Thesis up on the church in Wittenberg. And more recently, we talked about Ulrich Zwingli stirring things up in Switzerland. He and Luther did not see eye to eye on everything, but they were very big on wanting to reform the Catholic Church and later to sort of break away from them. And of course, just last week we talked about the extreme end of the Protestants, the Anabaptists, Menno Simmons and all of those guys. The Anabaptists, of course, were taking place in Switzerland, and last week we talked about what was going on in England. Henry VIII was reforming the church, so to speak, insofar as it made him more powerful. Again, he was not a church reformer, but he was a reformer insofar as it benefited him. He declared himself, or whoever else would be the King of England, as the head of the Church of England, and completely severed Britain from the church. So while humanism and the Renaissance are sweeping across the land, you can see, hindsight again, how some of this may have been God's work. There is really no point in debating whether or not the church had grown away from God. They had. They were doing lots of things that simply had no biblical basis, and they were acting in a very unchristlike manner. Killing people is unchristlike. That's just the way it is. When you fuel these questions with the new thinking of the Renaissance, you are throwing gas on a fire, and that's exactly what it was. And the Protestant Reformation was fairly widespread by the time John Calvin began his work. Again, by the age of 17, he had his master's degree and considered becoming a priest. He was very, very devout. He veered towards the study of the law, though. He was very, very much intrigued by law, the rule of law, the application of law. Much like everyone else inspired during the Renaissance, he heavily steeped in Greek and Roman classical type education. In his own words, he said in 1533, at the age of 17, I believe, he had what he called a sudden conversion. And he came to the conclusion, after prayer, reading his Bible and whatnot, a phrase that we're pretty familiar with, same phrase as Martin Luther and so many others. We're saved by grace, not by our merits, not by our works. So that puts him squarely in the corner of the Protestant reformers. Calvin was teaching Protestantism in France. The problem was France was still very heavily Catholic at this point, and much unlike Germany, which was welcoming Protestant reform with open arms, France was not. France was very, very much at odds with a lot of the rest of the Europe during this time. Very, very closely tied. King Francis I at the time was a devout Roman Catholic. 200 Protestants were captured. About 20 of them were executed by the King of France, one of Calvin's closest friends. Calvin left. He had to flee for his life, basically. The story goes that he was on his way to Strasbourg, Germany, when, while passing through Geneva in Switzerland, he was introduced to a man named William Farel. He begged John Calvin to stay in Geneva and preach with him. And again, you remember in Switzerland, we had Ulrich Zwingli and all the others in the Protestant Reformation, later the Anabaptists. It was big stuff. A lot of stuff in the Protestant realm was happening in Switzerland, and John Calvin agreed. He was a very humble man. He refused any increase in pay. He kept very few possessions. He never owned a home. He always lived with someone else. He was, again, not quite a vow of poverty, but something very close to it. He was very much a stickler for that. They were very effective. Calvin and Farel were in their preaching. Calvin was a very effective preacher, and he quickly rose to the forefront. And they adopted what they called a confession of faith and a set of rules that they said every citizen of Geneva would be required to sign and live by. Those who didn't would be punished. Well, for a 3-year span, they were kicked out of Geneva by members of the Geneva City Council. They found the preachers and their moral code a little bit too rigid, too hard to follow, and Calvin moved eventually. He made his way to Strasbourg, where he settled down. He married a widow and was starting a new life. But a weird thing happened. In Geneva, things weren't going well. The town preachers who were chosen to replace Calvin and Farel were very ineffective. The government was unstable. Crime went up. And all of a sudden, a more conservative group of council members was elected, and they said, you know, we didn't have these problems when John Calvin was calling things around here. So they asked him to come back. He eventually agreed to come back. He was not too keen on the idea at first. He reinstated, once he was back, that strict moral code for citizens. He raised what he called raised the standards of godly living. He forbade drinking, dancing, gambling, swearing, indecency, all other kinds of questionable activities. He followed the Old Testament guidelines and declared adultery, blasphemy, and idolatry as punishable by death. You heard me right, death. Other crimes, of course, fines, torture, prison, combination of all three, two of the three, what have you. Calvin did believe in the separation of church and state to a certain degree. He saw the church and state as two arms on the same body, working, literally and figuratively, hand in hand for the same purpose, separate but towards the same goal. So while he was not one of those who meshed religion and government, the crown and the cross, to where they were indistinguishable, he did have them working in tandem. So it was not a complete blending of church and state, but something very close to it. They put together a group called a consistory that would oversee the enforcement of this strict moral code that he drew up. Calvin put himself as part of that group. Some people say it made Geneva a wonderful place to live because everybody kind of behaved. Crime went down, good morals went up. However, there were some obvious drawbacks to this system, not the least of which the church, or what's acting as the church, declaring the right to kill someone for sinning. There's nothing in my Bible that says that still holds true. The promise of Jesus made all the Old Testament rules obsolete for Christians, and there is absolutely nothing in the words of Jesus that condones killing people for sinning. Nothing. To help against the sin of gluttony, council regulated the number of dishes that were allowed on a person's table. This is what happens when groups get power. It's far too often corrupted, even if you have the best of intentions. It was forbidden for children to name their parents after saints of the Catholic Church. A woman was fined for wearing her hair too high, whatever the heck that meant. 3 men were imprisoned for laughing in church. Not supposed to laugh. Children were punished for eating cake when they should have been in church. One man accused of writing a bad note about John Calvin was tortured twice a day for a month, then executed. It's impossible to square this with Christianity. impossible. Between the years 1542 and 1546, 58 people in Geneva were executed, killed. 76 banished from Geneva for some violation of this moral code. The most egregious example is the case of Michael Servetus. He was a heretic by the definition of the word, insofar as he taught that Jesus wasn't fully God. He wasn't Catholic, Protestant, or Anabaptist. He sounds very Gnostic. Gnostics do not actually. Gnostics are the opposite. Christ was fully divine but not fully human. He and his teachings were very confusing over the issue of Christ's deity. So, by the church's standards, he was a heretic. Well, he was arrested, and Calvin, of course, believed that the church had all the right in the world to condemn heretics. The subsequent trial of Servetus was a kangaroo trial at best. He was not allowed a chance to defend himself. He was not even allowed to hire counsel. Judgment was passed, and he was condemned to burn at the stake. Now, Calvin, to his credit, I guess, begged the city council not to burn him. He wanted them to just behead them. Burning takes a long time and is very torturous. The unfair trial of Michael Servetus and his death left a dark mark over the name of John Calvin for many years. I think the fact that he enforced a moral code that included the death penalty for people sinning is as black a mark as anything else. To me, that is evil. Now, I'll leave it to you to conclude. On the bright side, yeah, Geneva was probably a good place to live, very clean. People didn't want to break the moral code, but it doesn't sound like anybody was living. They were existing. John Calvin continued his work until a pretty old age. He was a stabilizing force in the Protestant Reformation, very much a thorn in the side to the Catholic Church. He wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, and it's pretty much considered the most classic statement of the Protestantism faith. His teachings were very clear, very distinct, and so much so that his followers were called Calvinists after him. Those who grew to adopt Calvin's interpretation of the Bible. And they spread throughout Europe, where they carried on their identity. In French, they were called the Huguenots. In Scotland, they became Presbyterians. In the Netherlands, they were called the Dutch Reformed Church, and in England, they were called Puritans. It was brave Calvinists who first landed in the Massachusetts colony. They were called Pilgrims when they landed in the New World by way of the Mayflower in 1620. These were John Calvin followers, very strict, very rigid. Calvin has had a widespread impact on history, perhaps more than any other religious figure during the Renaissance. Again, he helped for generations to define Protestantism. You can certainly disagree with the methods, and one of the things that happened that you'll see in Geneva at this time with this strict moral code, you remember the problems Jesus had consistently with the Pharisees, who were so strict on abiding by the Mosaic Code, the laws of Moses, no exceptions, 100% legalism. That's what it became, and our Savior himself, Jesus, warned us about the dangers of legalism. Love should be your guiding factor. Didn't mean to get off on my proselytizing box here, but again, for all his faults, John Calvin had a remarkable impact on the Protestant Reformation, probably more so than anyone else. We'll talk more about him on Monday. See you then.